Hi, Vance Davis with you again on my YouTube channel of Bible, and No Traditions. This is going to be our second lesson in dealing with the shepherds of Israel in the book of Ezekiel in chapter 34. We've concluded the first part of the lesson in talking directly about them. And so now let us come to the second part of our study in the text of Ezekiel 34, a text that we've read many, many times. I pray you've read it many times since the last study. But, I've preached some of these verses many, many times, and I've read it again and again of Ezekiel 34. So it's not being new to me to have read it so many times. Preachers should read the Bible many, many times. I learned from my brother Klein Payton many, many years ago that when one reads the stories and lessons from the Bible, to try and develop the habit of projecting yourself into the scene that you're reading. So I learned to do that from him, so that I could become a part of the scene. I could project myself into the scene, and I could just stand there and look around with what's going on and observe how the people's reactions are and listen to the teacher as they go on. So I've seen some things there, and that I've imagined as well. Some of the things just had to subsist in order for the things that did happen to occur, I believe. I have tried my best to stand there with Ezekiel as he pronounced these woes upon these wicked shepherds and these slothful men, these incompetent men, these incompetent, indolent shepherds who should have never allowed themselves to become shepherds. And I've looked into the faces of those sheep that Ezekiel saw as well, and I saw the fact that I think, having been there, as I looked upon them and saw their reaction, and then there began to appear to me on the screen of my mind my own reaction. And I believe that the first thought that came to me was that shepherds, elders that I have personally worked under, who had accepted a similar assignment from the same Lord that these wicked shepherds of Ezekiel 34 had faced, the only consequences of their failures are far greater than those of the ones of Israel, I believe. And the second thought I had was like unto it, and that is this: the record of many of the shepherds, elders that I've worked under is not all that much different from those of Ezekiel chapter 34. Not vastly different from theirs at all. And so I have read again and again and again over the past several years since I learned of this from Brother Klein Payton to start with. And I've sensed that I've heard and read the rules of their impeachment by being read by the same Lord who commissioned Ezekiel to prophesy against those shepherds of his day, and against anyone else, by the way, who would do as they have done after accepting the position and title of shepherd and elder. I tell you this, brethren, to share with you some of my reflections that I had, to literally do that and to do it honestly and share with you those reflections would be very embarrassing, not only to me, but perhaps even embarrassing to some of the elders and congregations of which I've served in the past. And sometimes some of the things I might say, as Klein said in his lesson, they might be libelous for me to even mention. For I've told you that I tried to project myself into those scenes, and I've looked into the faces of those people that Ezekiel was talking to, and here's what happened. The faces of the people to whom Ezekiel was speaking changed. I find myself not looking into the faces of men that lived several thousand years ago, but into the faces that I saw were the faces of the sheep in those folds where I had labored, but then they became the sheep where I had served with shepherds and elders, and then I saw their faces, people that I recognized, members of the congregations where I worked. It'd be really difficult for me to give you all those reflections that I've had and thought about, and also why it would be libelous for me to refer to them literally. I just don't want to give literal names and things of that nature. I don't think it would be proper. But these are people that I should have been feeding right along with the shepherds and the elders. Peoples that I have known for a long time to be unfed. And in my reflections, I've seen dozens of them, I believe, emaciated. Not because there was no food in the trough, but because there was no appetite for spiritual food. Nervosa anorexia came to mind. These are people that believe they can exist without any food. They believe that they don't even have to eat any longer. They somehow are going to live off the air which they breathe. Anemic, listless, and I see them stand before me indifferent to their own lostness. I've looked into the faces of these people who stood before me unconcerned, starved, worse yet, starved to death and not even knowing it. God pastured them in the care of the local elders, and they and I have allowed them to be scattered at times, to be unfed, and they begin dying on our hands. So in reading and rereading these passages of Scripture, I've heard the thunderous voice of omnipotence say again and again, I'm against those shepherds, and I'm against those who have allowed my sheep to starve this way and to wander away, and I will require my sheep at their hands. I've heard the Almightiness divest me of my role as a preacher. The more I've meditated upon these verses, the deeper and the more piercing have I been able to feel this indictment that identifies me with those shepherds with which I served, and along with those shepherds of Ezekiel 34. I think there's too much similarity between their record and our records for me to be judgmental. I found myself in the early readings of these passages wanting to speak out and maybe even try to help Ezekiel condemn those men. Then I found myself speaking as David did. Why, that man ought to die, David said to Nathan concerning the man who had taken the little ewe lamb away from a poor neighbor. But in thinking that, I heard Nathan say to me, Vance, thou art the man. And so my third reflection was, we, the elders and I, should all just quit. And then suddenly I thought, since it's easier to quit than it is to qualify, then we all should qualify. And while I stood there in the bare nakedness of my own individuality, feeling guilty and feeling ashamed, feeling weary under the weight of the burden and the weight of the finger of guilt that was pointing at me, three thoughts occurred to me quite suddenly. And they gave me a little relief. I thought first of all of what the Apostle Paul said in Romans 15, verse 4, that whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for my learning. And I was relieved in just thinking that thought. The Lord had written the 34th chapter of Ezekiel for me and the shepherds with which I had served. This is for all of our benefits. Whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope, says the King James Version. Very, very true. Would you agree? I hope you agree. The Scriptures give us some kind of relief. As I have read of the experiences of those men, I realize that this has been given to me as sort of an instructional material, as a schooling, a project to work on, so I can compare myself with them, and I can find myself coming up short. And you know, that's really the way it ought to be. That's why it was written, because I would find myself coming up short, and I could see myself in the own true light. And then the second thought, as I read, beginning in verse 13, that the Lord no longer speaks of the shepherds of Israel, but rather He's speaking to the flock and of the flock. So this thought occurred to me. Well, I'm not a shepherd. I'm also a sheep. I have shepherds over me who are supposed to love me and who are to look out after my soul and will have to give an answer unto the Lord one day for my conduct. And they share responsibility of tending the flock. And that brought a flood of relief to me and my soul. And as I thought of these men, one after another, shepherds who look over my condition and reprove and rebuke and exhort and all that, it takes a lot of long suffering on their part. But I'm thankful that they have it or should have it, and be thankful that they're here. And then the third thought, not only do I have shepherds with whom I work and function, but I also have the help of the Lord Himself. As Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 21, to this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in His steps. I'm a sheep. I have shepherds over me. And then there is shepherds over all of the shepherds. And then there's a chief shepherd over us all. And he is my example of what shepherds are to be and what I ought to be to a fold of his sheep. Listen to what it says again in Ezekiel 34, 15 and 16. Listen closely, for this is all that's truly required for one to be a shepherd of the Lord's people. The Lord said, I will be the shepherd of my sheep and have them lie down, declares the Lord. That's all elders have to do to bring this situation about in the congregation they serve. They should say, as it says in verse 16, I'll search for the lost. That's not hard. It takes some time. It takes patience. It takes energy. It takes devotion. It takes commitment. But it can be done. And so then they should say, and I can bring back the strays. I can bind up the injured, and I'll help strengthen the weak. I can do that. With the help of the Lord and with the help of the brethren, we can all do that. It helps to have these reflections, and it helps me to come to these conclusions. And I think I feel a whole lot better because of the process. I hope these 2 lessons on Ezekiel 34 have helped you. I hope you'll take these lessons and share them with the shepherds where you are, that they might listen to these lessons as well. And I truly believe that if you'll do that, and they'll look at these texts and look at themselves standing in their nakedness before the Lord, having to give an accountability for the sheep over which he has given them to shepherd, they too will see the need. If they're not qualified, don't quit. Get qualified. Make yourself qualified. Do the things that God has given you to do. God bless you all. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye-bye.